January. This is the Customer Success Architects Office Hours call. With me today, I have DeMarcus Mack and I have Gus and Romain also online so far, and hopefully we'll get some other people joining either live streaming via Twitch or in the Zoom session as well. So let me just share my screen for starters so everybody knows what it is that I'm looking at. There we go. So I've had a couple of weeks off for this, so I apologise now and up front for not being around to run these calls for the last few weeks. So it's been an interesting few weeks. I was out at our at the mothership, the head office in Palo Alto last week, so my time zones were rather messed up. And then the week before I was just out, so apologies for that. So what I wanted to do today is slightly different from the norm. I wanted to kind of talk about some of the platform features and so platform features and some of the good, the bad, and the ugly, maybe. Let's say it that way. What I'll do is I'll dig into some of the content that we've run through and presented with some internal groups and then some customers in what we call unvarnished truth sessions. And I'm not going to necessarily share the content on the screen, but I'm going to talk about some subjects and then invite commentary from the people on the call. Anybody wants to join in and add their opinion, or if they've got any other areas that they're also aware of that are, good, bad, or ugly, should we call them, or good, bad, or what's coming down the line, to be slightly more positive about it. So we'll probably start with storage, go into a bit of networking, and then maybe look at some operations pieces, and maybe around logging and migration, DR, that sort of thing. So depending how much conversation we get around this, how many questions, it kind of depends how far through the content we'll get. But so yeah, if anybody's got anything they want to raise as well, as normal, you have, if you're watching via Twitch, you've got the chat box there. You can drop me a message. If you're dialed in via Zoom, you've got both the Q&A and the chat session. And then if you're watching this recorded on YouTube, you can obviously post comments in the video there, and any questions we will hopefully cover off in the following call if it's via YouTube. Or a later call, depending when you're watching it. Okay, so let's crack on, right? So what I normally do on these calls, I normally sort of have a look at release notes and see where we are, but there hasn't actually been a drop now since the last major version back on the 16th of January. So we're expecting, there's big work going on now to do 1.10 release. So I'm not expecting, unless there's anything critical that pops up or a security thing, anything. I'm not expecting a drop between now and then, so I'm not really going to spend any time on that. So let's dig into kind of some good and some could be better features of storage, for example. So as you know, we have a couple of different storage options, and that's pretty cool, right? From a managed service offering in a cloud, we can provide you blindingly fast NVMe backed local storage presented through vSAN. And then we also have the ability to provision hosts that have scalable storage without having to scale out the hosts. And that is Amazon's EBS backed sort of vSAN. So still presents as vSAN, but we can scale that from 6 to 60 terabytes, whatever the limits are. So you have a number of options, right? You can have blindingly fast or not quite as fast storage, depending on your requirements. Okay, and in the most recent release of vSAN 6.7 U3, we had a load of enhancements put in there for better space management. So when you're doing policy changes, and there were performance improvements in there. So one of the gotchas that people often get is they start with a 3-node cluster, and they have a failures to tolerate of 1 as the default CERN policy, and they scale above 6 and they don't change their vSAN policy. Now, there's some work going on to automate that in the future, or at least make it pseudo automated, as in we will automate it, but we'll give you a warning and ask you if you want to do it first of all. Now, one of the most obvious reasons this is important is from a support perspective. Now, to remain within the support SLA, you actually have to have a failures to tolerate of 2 on RAID 5 or 6 if you are running 6 or more nodes in your cluster. But from a performance standpoint, it's also it's recommended as well. So by automating that and then giving you an option like a button to press that yes, I agree, let's do this. It kind of puts the onus back on you to agree to it. Now, can anybody that's online think of any of the negative reasons, or let's rephrase that, any of the reasons we're looking at putting that sort of okay or agree to button into the policy change there? I love it when it's quiet like this. So I guess from an obvious standpoint, there is vSAN overhead when you make a policy change. Imagine you'd scaled your environment to 12 hosts and was still running at the old vSAN policy, and we came along and just smashed down a different policy for you onto that environment. You are you're going to be faced with a lot of vSAN overhead. There's going to be extra duplication of data while that policy gets applied, which may have a negative impact on performance, and also may have an impact where autoscaler kicks in and adds new hosts because you're suddenly consuming a lot more storage, which is why we are putting that sort of if we roll this out, we're going to put that button in that says yes, I agree to allow this. And some of the changes that were made to that in the 6.7U3 enhancement was the stuff like, it doesn't do it all at once. There's a bit of lag between when you click apply new policy and it actually applying. So I guess that also leads on to another point where using a default policy or not using a default storage policy. Now, again, please feel free to chime in. Those of you who are listed as attendees or panelists, if you're muted, you can just very quickly unmute yourself. I've totally forgotten what I was talking about. So we're talking about policy changes in vSAN. Help me out. What was I going to say? Oh,
changing it to failures to tolerate.
yeah. So
or changing the default policy.
Oh yeah, change the default policy. Right. So thank you, Zach. So um, let's have a quick discussion about using the default storage policy. Any people massively in favor of using the default storage policy, or let me flip that around. Can anybody see any problems with using just the default storage policy in vSAN?
I mean, I think if you want, like, once you get to that 6+ hosts, I don't see any issue with using it because you can always set up separate policies for specific VMs if you really wanted to.
They're right. So you raise it right. So if you imagine VMC is a globally spread cloud, you've got multiple SDDCs deployed around the world. Because you're a large organization, it's highly likely you also have more than one person that's going to be going in there and playing around with vSAN storage policies. But they may not necessarily be aware of what was dropped on the platform that day or the day before. So if you use the default storage policy, and that's the only storage policy you have, or it's the main storage policy in use, and somebody drops a load of workloads on there and they think, oh, I need a very specific storage policy to give me the performance or the resilience I need for these workloads I've just stuck in there, and they change the default storage policy. What's going to happen then to everything else that is running under that default storage policy? It's going to change for those other workloads too, right? So come along the next day and somebody else puts some workloads on there and they require a different storage policy, so they go and change that default storage policy. So not only will it affect multiple other workloads that are outside their area of support or their remit, it makes it difficult unless you're massively familiar with it and everything on your platform runs and has the same requirements. If you set up different storage policies for different workloads, different environments, different DR requirements, for example. So obviously, the more failures to tolerate, the more storage you take up, right? So the more expensive that workload becomes. You might have workloads that don't require such a high level of resilience. Might just be a very quick test and dev workload that's going to sit on there for a couple of weeks, and you don't really care about it being binned or losing it in a DR environment scenario. But you certainly want your production P1 workloads having the best level of resilience you can, right? So attributing multiple different or having multiple different storage policies is good practice, shall we say? I won't say best practice because I hate best practice. But yeah, I think that having multiple storage policies and make them available should be the way forward, really, especially if you are in a multi environment or multi-platform environment or multi-support people environment. I think that it's the way forward, right? I'm happy to be challenged on that, but that's certainly a recommendation that myself and some of my colleagues have been talking about recently. Now, around storage, so some of the not so good stuff, for example, sequential writes are pretty slow. Something we've noticed. We've already kind of covered sort of touching the default policy or not. So that I guess that includes not changing the default policy, apart from the failures to tolerate for clusters of 6 or more hosts. But having multiple policies. In our documentation, I was talking to the product manager this morning about this. In our config maximum documentation, it calls out a soft limit of 16 hosts in a cluster. Does anybody online know what the maximum number of hosts you should have in a cluster are on VMC? Because we only call out a soft limit of 16. Do you know what the hard limit would be?
64,
Good,
maybe.
good guess. Unfortunately not. So
32, right?
16 is also the hard limit. And there's a number of reasons for this. And we were trying to get the documentation changed to show that it's not just a soft limit. It's actually, although you can kind of go beyond 16 hosts, it's not recommended for a number of reasons. Some of them are operational reasons, and some are sort of, let's get into conversations about whether you should run your cloud platform as you do an on-prem platform. But I think that's a wider discussion. But from an operational perspective, the more hosts you have in a cluster, the longer a maintenance window is going to be for that cluster. And although we don't just drop one host at a time and do it, imagine as a service provider, we're now running this for all of our customers, and we have very prescribed service windows in which to operate. So if we are trying to go from like 1.8 to version 1.9, for example, and you have lots of customers having 32 or 64 nodes, it's going to take a long time to be able to upgrade those environments. And there are, like I just mentioned briefly, there are conversations around, do you really need to have 64 nodes in a cluster? There are maybe some operational benefits like less waste, but if you're at these sort of 32 or 60 nodes in a cluster perspective, maybe it's actually better to have multiple clusters or even multiple SDDCs to support that rather than the big clusters you'd have on-prem. Happy again to be to be challenged on that one and have that lively discussion. But yeah, so it's a hole in our documentation at the moment. So it does say soft limit, not maximum. Anybody aware of the free space for vSAN requirements at the moment?
25%.
Yeah, so we have there's a couple of things, right? So there's a 30% free space for vSAN, and this is overhead that is currently being worked on. So reducing that as a percentage down to an actual gig reservation per host. So percentage wise, that would fluctuate depending on the number of hosts you have. And we often get challenged on why such a big amount of slack space. And I guess when you've got these big clusters, again, that's another negative to having massive clusters, is 30% of a 6-node cluster is a lot cheaper than 30% of a 32-node cluster or 64-node cluster, right? So so it is something that's being worked on right now, and autoscale is one of the things that autoscaler will kick in regardless, right? So I guess you're all familiar by now that you can set the autoscaler activities for memory, storage, and compute, so CPU. But you can turn off memory and CPU portion. You can't turn off the storage portion, and that's there so that we can maintain a service, right? We will auto scale your environment to ensure there's always at least 30% free space in storage, and that protects you from a sudden growth perspective, and it enables us to meet our support SLAs, right? Um, so what's coming down the wire? So we're talking to a number of partners about sort of their storage solutions. So presenting managed NFS for storage over Direct Connect, for example. We're in discussion with a number of people like this right now. Um, Direct attached EBS data stores, so without vSAN. Again, that's something that we're looking into making available. Now, when I'm talking about all these, what's coming down the wire, there's no defined date. We're still talking futures here, so please don't, start architecting to something that doesn't actually exist right now. And on that key point, the next piece of information is about the i3EN hosts. So these have greater than 50 terabytes of local SSD storage per host. So where I said before we had, two types of storage, we had blazingly fast vSANs running off NVMe's, and then the EBS back storage. So if you really want the blindingly fast storage but need to scale beyond the current i3s, then you're looking at the new i3Ns that is in kind of final testing right now, which will give you the really good combination of greater throughput on the NIC. So the XENI has now 100 gig instead of 25 gig. It's got up to or greater than 50 terabytes of local SSD storage. It's got more compute power as well. So we're just waiting on the compute portion of that right now to be signed off. And I did mention just briefly the reduction in slack space requirement. Now, I don't know what the final number is going to be, but it's going to be in the multi-hundred gig sort of area per host for slack space, which means that remains constant across all the hosts. So, like I said, it's changing from a percentage base to a fixed amount per host, and that's coming due to a lot of enhancements that are happening in vSAN itself, in the vSAN development. So, any questions on any of that I've just sort of covered? Anybody want to argue against any of my design choices there, or any of the information? And please feel free to argue. It's a much more fun conversation when it's more than just me in it.
It's about the EDRS. By default, there's no scale out for memory and CPU.
Yeah, so
Just
you can
you
set it
have
up
to
so it
change it
balance on
yourself.
cost or performance, right?
Yeah,
But storage is automatic. It's always in there. You can't turn that on or off. So yeah, good
correct.
point. Yeah. And actually, one of the interesting things on that so we talk about scale out. Now, if you want to scale back in, which we have the capability to do, scale out will scale out on any of the three elements whatsoever. So if you've turned on compute and memory and you have storage, if you breach any of the thresholds set for any of the three, it will automatically scale out. But if you want to scale back in, it has to meet all three of the metrics before it can scale back in automatically. So it's highly unlikely, unless you are just temporarily using the platform for mass expansion, but for a short period of time, it's highly unlikely you'll ever see a scale back in activity performed automatically. For example, storage has to be below 20% utilized for it to automatically scale back in. And we've talked about reasons for that in the past. But yeah, it's worth knowing about. Cool. So networking, this has a tendency to take quite a while to go through and be quite a big sort of subject. So from a direct connect perspective, now hopefully you're all familiar with what direct connect is. It's kind of generally provided by a third party, but it's a direct connection from that third party, like say Equinix, into the AWS environment. So fast connectivity. You can get slightly slower hosted direct connects, which have much slower speeds, but currently they're up to 10 gig per circuit, and you can have up to 4 per SDDC. And it uses sort of BGP to advertise routes over there, so standard networking constructs. And you use it to connect your SDDCs, and it has jumbo frames enabled. So there's some of the cool stuff about it. Now, some of the not so good stuff about it, or some of the things to be aware of. So the management slider that you first pick when you set up your environment, that's not advertised in BGP. So you need to be aware of that. The hosts are always routed to the direct connect if one is connected. So if you have DR as a service, for example, you can't advertise those over any sort of interconnecting routes. It's always going to go out of the direct connect. Meaning if you have 3 sites, you have 2 on-prem and 2 clouds, the traffic will always go back on-prem and come back out again. The direct connect is region based, so it's not AZ based, but it is region based. So if you have, if you're in EU, London, for example, your direct connect will not be, you can't use it for, say, a Frankfurt connection, for example. So the other side of that as well is there's a thing called a direct connect gateway, a construct from Amazon. We don't currently support that, so it's not currently available to the VMware Cloud on AWS SDCs. And I mentioned there are kind of different connections around a direct connect, one of them being the hosted VIF. Now this is only supports a single VIF, so on a standard direct connect up to 10 gig, you can have, I think, 50 VIFs. Please shout if I'm making that up. But yeah, you have up to 50 VIFs you can use to the virtual interface. On a hosted VIF, you literally only have a single VIF, and so it's pretty much then dedicated per SDDC. And yeah, so 50 VIFs. So let's see sort of futures. We're looking at creating a private VIF. So sorry, a bit more information. So the private VIF is owned by the shadow account, and when you set up, you set the ASN in VMC before creating the VIF, and there is a default ASN number there. And BGP that I mentioned before is terminated on the AWS virtual gateway in the shadow account. So basically it has then static routes from that VGW through to the SDDC tier 0 at the edge. Okay, that's kind of the path it takes. So the DX terminates at the AWS VGW. And there is currently a list of 16 advertised routes, BGP advertised routes or sessions over the direct connect. Now this is a soft limit of 16, and a few of my colleagues online, we've had a few chats about this before, and we've come across this with a number of customers. Where this becomes a problem is where you have more than 16 networks on-prem. For example, you might have lots of small slash 27, 28 networks on-prem that you're trying to advertise over the DX. Any more than 16 automatically get dropped, so they show as inactive. Now, it's a soft limit, meaning that you can request an increase to that, and it's an AWS imposed limit, so not a VMware VMC imposed limit, it's an AWS thing, and it's to do with available sort of interfaces on their POPs. So there is a theoretical hard limit as well for each AZ and each POP, should I say? But at the moment, the hard limit, as per their documentation, is 100 advertised segments. So you can't go more than 100 networks advertised per DX into your, or sorry, per VIF into your SDDC. And even then, AWS may actually run out of available capacity on their POPs. So it's something that we have to go off to AWS to request an update on. So just be aware that if you have more than 16 networks that you're trying to bring to AWS, so VMC on AWS, that it's something that we should hopefully have captured in early calls. But if you're not necessarily engaged with a customer success architect or some of the pre-sales teams, it's not something you mention to them, you may hit that as a bit of a stumbling block. Okay, so I don't really want to get into the managed transit gateway conversation, but I will. So those of you that are familiar with native AWS constructs, there's something called a transit gateway, which allows you to kind of route or share services through AWS interconnects between VPCs, right? So We can also connect to a transit gateway natively, but we connect via a VPN from the SDDC to a transit gateway, meaning that there are limitations on the amount of bandwidth available. And you can now sort of connect multiple VPNs to that transit gateway to with ECMP enabled, so you get a bit more bandwidth, but you're still limited as opposed to, for example, connecting a direct connect to a transit gateway, or in the same way that AWS connects their VPCs. Um, so at the moment, the transit gateway supports up to 50 gig total throughput, and we've tested um, up to about 12 gig between, or we've seen, should I say, about 12 gig between two SDDCs. So it's pretty, it's pretty fast, but there are still limits there. Um, the to connect to your own VPC, there are kind of multiple steps and request process involved. So I definitely reach out to like a customer success architect, or if you have a specialist SE involved with you, definitely speak to them first. There are also some AWS steps that you need to go through as well. So it's definitely worth bringing this up before you need it, should I say. Now, a way around this, and a way around some of the challenges we've noticed of pushing certain network types over the transit gateway, is a concept called, or a construct called, a managed transit gateway. So this would be a VMware owned and managed equivalent of the transit gateway. Um, but it isn't out yet, right? So what I'm not going to do is to talk about design options or go into it in too much detail, because if I do and you design to it, it's probably going to change between now and when it gets released anyway. But it's definitely worth knowing that it's coming and having it in your back pocket. But if you need to connect to native services, you should potentially think about using the linked VPC. So you have that cross ENI connection with a 25 gig connect. And if that's not applicable, for example, you have services already provisioned in VPCs, you can still connect to them via a transit gateway. You're just limited to VPN connectivity to that transit gateway. So just something to be aware of there. Um, and into the transit gateway is also for inter-peering, inter-region peering at the moment. So it's not for replicating SDDCs between different regions, for example. So it's not the answer to that question. And anybody want to bring anything up around that subject at all? Cool. Okay.
Native AWS does now have in intra region
Indeed. Yes. So they've just released
TGW
that. So yeah.
between TGWs.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the reason I just sort of mumbled through it at the end there, is that even though they do, we don't. We don't currently support that. Um, so it was released fairly recently, I think, on the AWS side, but we don't
Yeah, I
support
think
it
it
yet.
was reInvent.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, like you said, we don't support it at all at this
yeah.
point.
And I'm not sure we ever will, but it'll be something that we will have to generate a solution for, but I don't think it'll be the standard in the same way that we're coming up with a managed transit gateway. It'll be something probably along those lines. Okay, so talk a little bit about network scale and performance. So um, I briefly mentioned that VPN, you can now do ECMP, or equal cost multipathing, on VPNs, which is cool. And a graceful restart was also added in the M9 or 1.9 release. Um, and I also mentioned already that the i3N has better network performance, which is better for running edges on, so to host the NSX edges. And NSX 2.5 that you remember was dropped in version 1.9 as well. That dramatically improves the firewall object scale as well. So there are options for things like nested groups and improved numbers of objects per group as well. Um, Now, some of the stuff that we didn't necessarily anticipate when we first brought the service out, or didn't accommodate very well, was that VMC is kind of, it's designed, it was thought of as being a large cloud platform. It didn't actually accommodate the massive platforms that some customers are running, but equally, it's not really designed for really small scale platforms as well. But there are a number of things that customers need to be really aware of that they often don't know or understand about their own on-prem environments before they move to VMC. Okay, so um, things like north-south traffic for the environment, right? You need to think about not just who's going out to the internet, but once you move to VMC, you've got to think about where your backup traffic is going to go. Are you immediately going to swap a workload to backup to a new backup target in VMC? So one of the backup providers that can back up natively to S3, for example, which is great, but or is it going to back up back onto on-prem? Because either way, if it's a new backup for that object, because it may be a new object or it may be a migrated object, the first backup is always going to be a full backup. So if you are dumping, 100 terabytes of data into VMC, you're going to be doing a brand new backup probably for all 100 terabytes. And if you're coming back on-prem to back those up, that's 100 terabytes of network egress charging, for example, or 100 terabytes that you're pushing through those edges as you're migrating onto the platform. So something to be aware of. There's also something that's come up recently, which is, I guess, a figure that we now need to know about to help you design a platform well and in a stable manner, but you probably don't have any clue about on-prem, and that's packets per seconds versus bandwidth. People often talk about, as I've done already, the how big the pipe is, whether it's a 25 gig pipe or a 10 gig pipe or 100 gig pipe. But what we never talk about is packets per seconds, and we've seen in some of our largest customer use cases that they're actually hitting limits that we didn't really know existed. And this is the number of packets per second going over the edges. And we, talking to the product managers this morning, we're actually, I guess all of you are familiar with the network, sorry, not network, the VMC sizer tool, right? So the tool that you can go and plug in your requirements and it spits out how many nodes you need and yada, yada, yada. So that tool is constantly under development. It's already had one facelift. It's getting more work done to it as we speak. But we're looking to plug in things like the configuration maximums that we have on the config maximum site, and things like maximum throughput, maximum packets per second supported by the edges, so that if you plug those numbers in when you're thinking about designing the environment or thinking about sort of scaling out, we will instantly, and before you try and do it, throw up warnings or errors if we think you're going to breach any of the supported or tested limits. So that's again a change from on-prem, and I guess because an on-prem environment is typically more static apart from when you first build it. But things like packets per second, you never really worry about, right? That's because your typical on-prem networking is often oversized and overscaled rather than being as correct and as lean as you would have in a cloud environment, right? So the performance there is kind of limited at the edge node, right? And that's also limited by the problems we saw were limited by the CPU on the edge router. And things like the AWS NIC as well has a limit that we've breached in some areas where we've seen sort of performance hits. So there are kind of, I think the maximum we've seen was like 2.2 million packets per second, and then after that we're starting to see issues. And the way we're calculating is on the edge node, the routes and the packets in and out. So the NIC load is kind of 2 times the edge load. So we then have to add management and vSAN traffic into there as well. So we see sort of baseline numbers of like 300,000 packets per second for a freshly deployed environment. And then we're topping out at 2 point something million packets per second where we have issues. And I think so 300 to 650,000 packets per second is kind of the north-south traffic that we see per SDDC on average. And one of the recommendations we make here are to enable jumbo frames, for example. As my colleague Michael says, jumbo frames are your friend. you just have to remember to introduce your friend to every bit of that network. So you need to ensure that Jumbo Frames is enabled end to end. So if you're routing back on-prem, everything on-prem has to have Jumbo Frames enabled, because you're reducing the numbers of packets because they're bigger packets, right? Kind of makes sense, yeah. Um, so yeah, by enabling Jumbo Frames, you are reducing the packets, and you're hopefully not going to get anywhere near those limits anytime soon. But again, definitely something that you kind of need to know and factor into your design. Sorry, was there a question?
Yes, I have a question. So
Cool. I thought you would,
regarding
Nicola.
the hello there. So the question regarding the jumbo frames.
Yeah,
So in a hybrid setup where we have, an extension of our on-prem
sure.
resources,
Yep.
over in VMC, such as the case I'm pursuing, can we have jumbo frames enabled only in the cloud, or it is a must-have, both on-prem through A to Z, jumbo frame
So
enablement
if you're
for use cases?
if you've got traffic going from on-prem to the cloud and back again, if you don't enable jumbo frames at every single hop, you're going to get packet fragmentation happening. You're going to get drop packets, so you're going to get issues with your networking basically. So I know that from the early days of VCD, VMware Cloud Director, when we were first deploying that, one of the prerequisites was to enable jumbo frames, because in the early days of the overlay network first coming out, you had to have that extra 26 bits, I think, or I can't remember how many extra bits it was on the network. So the recommendation was just to enable jumbo frames throughout, because it was easier, and it meant that there were no sort of packets being stripped or spliced, should I say. So yeah, you definitely need to, whatever you set it to, however large you set it, it has to be every hop that you are sending those packets through.
Yeah. And the performance is only gained if your application actually uses jumbo frames.
Yeah, it's so
Like
okay. So there is
HCX is now supports jumbo frames, so that would be a potential
yeah, no, absolutely. But
boost.
so there are two ways of looking at it, right? There's performance and then there's limitations, right? So if you are um, if you're breaching thresholds or the upper limit of the numbers of packets per second that we can physically push through the edges, then by enabling jumbo frames, you're reducing those numbers, right? So it might not be for a speed thing, but you're not getting issues caused by too many packets, should I say? But yeah, good point. I mean, it's kind of a two thing. It's performance and maximum throughput. Make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I kind of knew from the on-prem implementation that it's a requirement A to Z, but I guess the networking, logic remains the same, even
Yeah,
for the hybrid
absolutely.
setup.
Yeah, just because it's now a VMware Cloud on AWS data center. Um, to be fair, there's a lot. That's I'm summarizing. But it's still another data center that you're having to connect to over the network, right? So it's not the concept is still one data center to another. There's some AWS wizardry that goes on in the background, but it's still just two data centers. Cool. So from an operational standpoint, so monitoring and alerting. So VROPS or vRealize Operations product that's been around for a long time. It works great with VMC. It is remember we say that VMC on AWS is kind of 90% the same as on-prem when you take into account that it's managed and you have some restricted permissions in there. VROPS still works fantastically well with it, whether it be SaaS-based VROPS or it be VROPS on-prem. Again, it's still just another vCenter and it's still just another set of hosts that you're collecting metrics against and kind of monitoring and creating dashboards, views, and alerts for, right? Similarly, Wavefront, which is another of our products, is fantastic, but not available for customers to see all of your SDDC yet. And I say yet because obviously that's another service we have. It's a SaaS-based thing, and it's something that we are looking to to make better and to see more. For example, there was a trial with one of the customers who was plugging some information into Wavefront, which enabled them to see some performance monitoring on the host that you wouldn't normally get with VROPS, and you wouldn't get from anything else because that's in the managed portion of the environment. So maybe the guys in the team that have been running that kind of proof of concept or pilot with the customer, maybe they can come on a call later on and sort of list out exactly what they've done and why they've done it with Wavefront, which is quite interesting stuff. So from a monitoring standpoint, we are monitoring your environment. We are managing it for you. We have autoscaler, like I've mentioned, that will handle capacity issues. There is a VMC monitoring bundle, which includes sort of lots of necessary monitoring products, and that's coming soon. Again, futures, so no release date on that, but keep your eyes peeled. Just remember though that we are managing the platform, so it's infrastructure as a service. So I don't think I really need to call it out, but you are still responsible for monitoring your own VMs. So that's from performance and connectivity standpoints. So we don't monitor your VMs. We don't currently, obviously we don't know what's inside the VMs. Even if you told us what VMs were for, like I have a special cluster for SQL, we don't strictly care, and we don't really want to know what's inside your VMs. That's your environment, right? We'll only monitor and respond to infrastructure level issues, so things that are affecting the managed components. For example, we back up the management VMs, and we monitor and maintain the management appliances that are in there, but just not your VMs. So some of the questionable things, should we say, about that is that if you have multiple SDDCs that you've deployed, and then you're monitoring them with VROPS, the cluster names are the same across the board, right? So when you are looking in VROPS, you might see cluster 1 multiple times because you've got multiple cluster 1s, because you've got multiple SDDCs, or whatever the naming convention is. There's no logic because each SDDC is a silo. There's no logic that can automate or that we've included, shall I say, that gives them unique names, or no ability for you to uniquely name them at this stage, right? VROPS will see them as the same. So you can configure vCenter alerting, but alerting methods are not they're not strictly the same. Some work well and others don't, or as well, should I say, as on-prem. There are no things like SNMP traps, so you can send an email, but the sender address and the mail host are not configurable. So you will get an email from a generic address every single time. Okay. And AWS actually throttles SMTP unless you request for it to be removed. So we've seen a couple of issues with customers there. And you also need to check the support user feature is enabled to your cloud service portal account, your org user account. Otherwise, you cannot open SRs. Only the support user or user with the support user flag on can actually log tickets. Okay. Anything questionable there? Anything you want to bring up? Anybody else? Okay, so I'm going to try and speed up a little bit because I'm taking quite a long time to do this. But so upgrades, as you know, it's a managed platform. We upgrade the platform generally at least every quarter with minor upgrades in between. Some customers, or sometimes they have skipped a major release for various reasons, mid migration plans and stuff. We're looking at making these upgrades less prescriptive, so you can request skipping a bit more easily. So we are looking at testing ways of making them not so linear. So you can go from, for example, you're on 1.8 v3 now, you can skip 1.9 and go straight to 1.10, or you're on 1.9 and you can go straight to 1.11 without having to go 1.11 to 1.12 and 1.30, that sort of thing. So you can skip interval updates if possible. And obviously there's a connectivity outage of 10 to 15 seconds during the NSXT upgrade. So definitely worth knowing about that. And then also, if you're running HCX and you you're dropping the platform, for example, it's just worth knowing, you shouldn't be doing migrations while upgrades are happening and vice versa. So, which is why we notify you, but we also request that you come to us and let us know if you're doing any major upgrades, or you've got any major work going on the platform that can't be interrupted. So we're also looking at doing weekend production upgrades as well. So a lot of customers have said, during the week upgrades impact the business too much because of the connectivity outages. So can we get some weekend production upgrades going? Also, we're improving the automation and scheduling for upgrades as well. So look out for some improvements there. And any questions or anything on that? Oh, good. Okay. So we backup and DR. So still from an operational standpoint, we provide you with DR service, and third-party vendors provide you with a backup service. So we don't currently offer you any backup operations ourselves. If you're using VMC as a DR site, you have to ensure that there'll be sufficient resources available. So what some people believe, even for migration events, they'll deploy the minimum 3-node cluster and then start migrating loads and loads and loads of workloads on, hoping that Autoscaler stays ahead of the migration event and keeps adding hosts in order. It's not an ideal place to be because you might be migrating or failing over sites a lot faster than Autoscaler is going to kick in, and also the rebalance activities that have to occur after every host add from a vSAN perspective is quite labor intensive. So it's much more advisable to have the resource and capacity in place before you try and instigate a DR scenario or using it as a backup target. Okay. SRM as a site recovery manager supports native SRM to VSRM, so you can do SDDC to SDDC, you can do on-prem to SDDC, and you can do SDDC to on-prem. So there's nothing weird or strange about SRM. The third-party backup solutions now, they typically offer a in VMC option or an S3 kind of bucket option to keep your costs down, so you're not actually storing your backups on the expensive i3 host, for example. And we're looking at, for example, including SRM and VSRM with the HCX data path to improve DR capabilities there if you're running running HCX, and we're looking at a low-cost DR solution, so you can push your workloads direct to S3 rather than going via VMC and then out to S3, and then we have kind of a build and rehydrate recovery option. So that would remove the requirement to have however many hosts running that can run your on-prem environment in case of a DR scenario. I think there are a couple of vendors out there. I think Datrium might be one of the vendors that do that as an offering, where they push replicas of your VMs on-prem direct into S3. So there's a little bit more effort, and it's not going to be quite as quick. So if you're looking at a really low recovery time objective, that's not necessarily for you, but it does give you a lower cost sort of DR solution. Any questions there? Okay, on to logging. So as I'm sure you're all aware, we use vRealize Log Insight for Cloud to log everything that goes on in the environment, and you have access to some of it. It's a free service, but it has limited capacity. So things like the networking data on the free service is limited to, is it a gig? Please correct me if I'm wrong there. And as soon as we hit the gig limit, then you're out of luck for more logs for that day. So it's a gig per day.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Well,
was
I
that?
think it rolls
Haha.
is
So
what
this
we
is
discussed.
this is an open question, right? So I wouldn't.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not entirely convinced it is. And we were having a chat this morning with the product manager and getting his feedback, and it's not 100% clear whether it rolls or as soon as you hit the gig, that's it. So I'll do some more digging on that, and I'll come back with a fixed answer. Okay. So you can do firewall logging, for example, but it can get costly because it's not in the free tier. So you're paying per um, to get more than that, 1 gig limit, for example. And as it stands at the moment, there's no automated way to subscribe to term discounts for logging. Okay. But again, a lot of we're hoping to see lots of improvements in SaaS ability, shall we say, and around the billing and self-subscribe models. So watch this space. So you get sort of free vRealize Login Site Cloud access once you sign up for VMC on AWS, and you can forward logs from VRLIC to on-prem via cloud or collector VMs. Again, though, if you are using the free tier, then you're not obviously going to get all logs forwarded. So it might be worth investigating the non-free tier. So we're also looking at, in the future, providing to you CSP logging, so the Cloud Service Portal. So this thing you see on screen here, this is the Cloud Service Portal where all my different SaaS services are available, and also adding VMC audit logging as well to those logs. Okay. Anything else? Anybody want to jump in around logging? Okay, so one important thing on logging that I forgot to mention is that all logs get pushed to the US. So all logs are, at least at some point in their life, living inside the US borders, which may be an issue for you from a compliance or regional compliance perspective. There's a number of reasons for this, primarily because when the service was instantiated, the SRE teams were in the US, and that's where all the logging infrastructure got built out. And there are no easy mechanisms with no cheap easy mechanisms, shall we say, for creating clones of all those logs in multiple geos or deciding which logs go to which geo. So it's just something to be aware of. Okay. Cool. So I kind of jumped into logs when actually I sort of wanted to stay on the big the DR sort of subject, but because it flows nicely into migration as well. So we, as you know, we have a product called HCX, so we have lots of different ways of migrating onto a platform. You may also know that you can use SRM as a one-way migration strategy. So you could set up the VMC as a DR target, start replicating the VMs over in the background, and then do a one-time failover because of the orchestration that's built into site recovery. So you could use things like re-IPing at that time. So we have a number of different sort of migration strategies, bulk migration, whether that's through HCX or vSphere application SRM or vMotion. So we've got sort of optimized vMotion now. We've got replication assisted vMotion capabilities, long distance vMotion, and then we also have sort of, like I said before, SRM and failover. As it stands, HCX kind of provides the best user experience for layer 2 extension, so the ability to vMotion between on-prem and the cloud, or even one cloud to another, but there's no HA options for layer 2 extension. So everything goes through one appliance basically from on-prem. So there are discussions, warm discussions, shall we say, in the team always about single points of failure or whether that's a problem. These appliances have really fast boot times, so if it dropped or HA restarted it because the host died, you would have an interruption to your extended layer 2 network. But then if you were running HA on natively with NSX, you're still going to suffer some impact while they flip over as well. So it just depends what kind of outage you can sustain, which will drive the design choice on that one. So layer 2 VPN, for example, has not great user experience, i.e. the console, the setup for it isn't fantastic in NSX, but it does have HA. It's actually worth noting, right? So we've talked about sort of update cadence for the VMC platform, but there's an even faster update cadence in some respects for HCX, and it's slightly more mandated in the sense that if you have HCX running on-prem, we are going to be updating HCX quite frequently, and you have to maintain compatibility. So we will only support 3 versions, so N-3, so current and going back 2 or 3, I think it is. Which means that if you get to a stage where you're trying to migrate and you've updated the on-prem, so you can't just jump from version 1 to version 4, for example, because there's more than 3 versions being skipped, just won't work. So your entire process around updating software kind of has to update to and be capable to update fast enough to take that into account. So it's just one thing to know about with HCX that catches some people out. So I mentioned you can use DR. So I guess the problem with using site recovery to migrate on there is that there's an additional cost to using Site Recovery Manager, whereas HCX comes along with the service, but there's no testing option like there is in SRM. So it's kind of a, if you've got all the money in the world, you may decide to use SRM, especially if you're using it already because you're familiar with it. If you are cost constrained, but don't necessarily need to test some of the stuff you're migrating over, HCX is much more point solution for you. Now I'm running really close to the top of the hour here for the call. So what I'll do is I'll end it there before going into any more details, which is unusual for me to get to the top of the hour and actually still have stuff to talk about. So I guess there's a first for everything, but I will pick up on the call next week and go into DR a little bit more, and then maybe talk about some of the automation stuff that I haven't covered yet. And then maybe a little bit more into kind of config maximums and routes to market. So at least I've got some content for you to wet your whistle with next week. But if there's any questions right now, anybody want to talk about anything or ask me anything I've covered, please feel free to jump in now or leave comments on YouTube.
So really quickly, can you just tell us, what's the outlook for the, other than for the hosts, right, available, for VMC? We know that there's i3 and R5,
Sure. Yeah.
It's either available or it's coming out soon.
So we currently have i3 and R5, right? And that's the NVMe or the EBS backed storage to the R5. So i3EN is the next host that's coming out, and that's the one that's got more memory, newer CPUs, much up to sort of greater than 50 terabytes onboard storage, and the faster interconnect over the across the ENI, so 100 gig. So that is due out. And I can't tell you a date because it's really, really close, but until they release, they're not going to give us a date either. So but they, just to help you out there, they are looking at a migration utility so that if you deploy a cluster of i3s and then you want to be able to change them into i3Ns, there'll be an in-place upgrade option available. So that's we've been promised that'll be available at i3N available date as well. So when that goes GA, the migration utility will be there. So you don't have to deploy a new cluster of i3ENs and then migrate into the new i3ENs. You should be able to do an in-place upgrade.
So is it fair to say that within the next 3 to 6 months, that host will be available for the customers?
Nicola, that's what you say. I would say yes, but I wouldn't commit to a specific
tentatively
date.
saying yes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Got it. I have another question, but I'll leave that with our own internal discussion with the architect, with Zach or someone from VMC about being able to swap the subscription that we have for i3s for i3ENs.
Cool.
But that's more of administrative.
Definitely leave that with Zach. Yes.
Okay.
Brilliant. Well, listen, thank you everybody for joining and asking questions and being involved. Thanks to the other architects on the line as well. As per normal, you can check this out on YouTube within a couple of days, and then also I'll be back here next week as well. So hopefully I'll see you all then as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.